Okay, so we're going to make a start with this webinar. Thank you for attending. This webinar is going to be about our transition policy that we published last week regarding the different version of the Bonsucro Production Standard. Before we start the presentation, a few house rules. Just to mention, as you might have heard, the session is going to be recorded, and we're doing so we can then share the recording on our website for people to be able to access and review the information. We have a Q&A function activated for you to post your questions, and we'll answer the questions at the end of the presentation. So today what we're going to cover, we're going to give you a bit of an overview of the different Bonsucro Production Standard versions that have been happening in use this year and going to be in use next year. We'll give you like a bit of a background as to why there is this new version of the transition policy. We'll give you also some key elements of the content of the transition policy, and then a little bit about next steps, and we'll open up for questions. So first, to go back a little bit on the timeline, as you know, in January of this year, in January 2022, we published a new version of the Bonsucro Production Standard, version 5.1. During that period of time, a number of activities took place, and from April 2022, operators will offer the possibility to opt in to be audited to that new standard, or keep being audited against the previous standard, version 4.2. From 1st of September 2022, the Bonsucro Production Standard version 4.2 was phased out with the intention of only retaining version 5.1. Then a number of conversations took place, and during Bonsucro Global Week, our board of directors decided to extend the validity of Bonsucro Production Standard version 4.2 until December 2023 to allow for a smoother transition for all operators and give a bit more time for Bonsucro to address some of the challenges. So as you can see on this graph, from October 2022 until 1st of December 2023, the both versions of the standard 5.1 and 4.2 remain valid. And then during that period of time, there will be an interim review of 5.1 with a view to publish a version 5.2, so an improved version of 5.1 at the end of, in the later part of 2023, which would take, precedence in late 2023. So why was there an extension of version 4.2 of the Bonsucro Production Standard? Well, that's mainly because we realized we need a bit more time to facilitate the transition to the new Bonsucro Production Standard version 5.1, and giving a bit more time for operators to prepare and engage with that new standard, new requirements. Also, we realized that we need a bit more time ourselves to review the standard wording and make sure that the supporting documents like the calculator, the implementation guidance, the auditing guidance were really truly aligned with the standards, and that it was really clearly worded across the board. So that additional time is going to enable Bonsucro Secretariat to work on this in 2023. So a bit more precision about that timeline in terms of the auditability of the standard. So as I mentioned, following the discussion and the decision at Bonsucro Global Week in October, you can see that from October 2022 until 1st of December 2023, both versions of the standard, the production standard, are valid for audits. So it's version 4.2 and version 5.1. You can choose either version to be audited against. Obviously, we try to encourage 5.1 because that's particular interest for us to get more learning about that new standard. And that standard brings a lot of valuable insights into today's challenges in terms of sugarcane sustainability. But you have both options during that period of time. And then if you look at the lower part of this graph, you can see that what we are actually doing at the moment is that we are doing an interim revision of standard 5.1 with a view to publishing a version 5.2. The publication date is aimed for June 2023. So that's when this improved version of the standard and the the supporting documents will be published, giving Bonsucro a few months to then support the operators and the auditors and the other service providers into receiving training and preparing for audits. And then from 2nd of December 2023, we will phase out 4.2 and 5.1, and the only auditable version of the standard will be 5.2. Now, a quick overview of the actual transition policy. So we had published a transition policy version 1 back in March this year to support the transition to 5.1. What we have done, considering that the implementability of 4.2 is now being extended, is that we have revised that transition policy to incorporate additional consideration in terms of our protocol and other elements to give you a full range of options and support, no matter which version of the standard you are choosing until December of next year. So what the policy includes is a set of general rules and clarifications, some more specific rules around auditing. In Annex 1, we basically retransferred the first version of the transition policy, which gives you like adapted pathway to complying with some of the indicators of the production standard version 5.1. In Annex 2, we created an adapted transition pathway for one of the more contentious area in version 4.2 of the production standard to make sure it can work with the certification protocol. In Annex 3, you have some consideration around EU Red and operators and auditors who are performing or receiving audits against Bonsucro Production Standard and Bonsucro EU Red Standard. And then finally, in Annex 4, we gave a few pointers and options for auditors and trainers, as in service providers licensed by Bonsucro, around the qualification of their staff to version 4.2 of the production standard. So we go into more details now about some of those aspects. So in terms of one of the general rules we want to emphasize is that both versions of the standards are options for operators until 1st of December 2023. And obviously, we want to encourage operators to choose 5.1. But when it comes down to projects and benchmarking exercise Bonsucro is carrying out, we will choose 5.1 as our preferred option to support those projects in the benchmarking exercise, because there are a number of thematics there that are not necessarily covered in the old version, and we want to make sure that we move forward. However, when it comes down to the pure service of auditing and certification, operators do have a choice, and we are expecting certification bodies and auditors to support that choice and facilitate the audits to the standard version of the operator's choice. In terms of auditing rules, so a few highlights, some of them I've already mentioned. So until 1st of December 2023, operators can choose and decide which version of the standard they want to be audited against. And that means any audit that starts before or on the 1st of December 2023 still has that option. However, from 2nd of December 2023, so any audit starting on 2nd of December 2023 or after will have to be conducted to the new updated version 5.2, which we'll publish next year. Another key principle for us is that once an operator has been audited against a version of the Bonsucro Production Standard, the subsequent audit, the audit after, has to be against the same version of the standard or a newer version of the standard. For example, if you get audited to 5.1, you cannot then in the next audit reverse back to 4.2. But you could decide to go for 5.1 and then the next one to 5.2, or go directly from 4.2 to 5.2 at the end of 2023. There's different options, but you cannot go back in terms of versioning. And then another aspect is in terms of publication transparency, we will publish on our website, on the page where we have the list of certificate holders, which version of the Bonsucro Production Standard an operator is certified against. A few more rules. So since July 2022, a reminder that the certification protocol version 6 applies to all audits. So since July 2022, any audit, regardless if they were to Bonsucro Production Standard 4.2 or version 5.1, had to be against following the protocol version 6. There was that lapse of 2 months where the new protocol and the old standard were going to cohabit. So we had to find some workarounds with certification bodies. Now that the version of 4.2 for the production standard is being extended until 2023, we've captured some key adaptation in this transition policy to support operators and auditors. So one key element we wanted to highlight is that the pass rate for audits, which is described in the protocol in table 10, is the pass rate for all audits. So whether it's version 4.2 or version 5.1, which means that what is applicable is that the operator has to comply with 100% of core indicators and at least 60% of non-core indicators, which is again the pass rate that is in the protocol. And those pass rates then enable the operators to receive a positive certification decision. It doesn't mean that they only work on 60% of non-core, but that's the minimum required for that certification decision to happen. What we did last week is we published a new version of calculator 4.1.6 to reflect that pass rate. So it's an updated calculator that is to be used in conjunction with Bonsucro Production Standard 4.2, and it now has integrated that pass rates to align with the protocol. One more rule in terms of auditing. So we want to reassure operators that the certification cycles are not affected by the extension of Bonsucro Production Standard 4.2. It means that if you still receive a certificate for 3 years, you still audited every year, and this doesn't change. The version of the standard or new certificate gets updated as and when you decide to change the production standard version. So it's the same cycle that we're not asking to restart the cycle of certification, and the version of the standard gets updated as and when. One aspect of the protocol as well we had to update in this transition policy is the mention of strategic indicators. So in the certification protocol, we indicate that that was published in June last year. Sorry, in June of this year. No, in June of last year. Sorry, of this year. Sorry for the confusion. So so it became applicable, the protocol, in July of this year, but it was published in December of last year. So in that protocol, what we indicated is that we were going to publish a bit more information following audits. So far, we were publishing a list of certificate holders, suspensions, and decertifications. But now we're going to start publishing some level of information about audits, such as the audit dates, overall percentage of compliance with core and non-core, and specific indicators results. So before going to that, I would like to clarify that we are not publishing any commercially sensitive information. We're not publishing information relating to the data in the input data tab on the calculator. What we are publishing is whether the operator is compliant or non-compliant with that indicator, and a little narrative agreed between the operator and the auditor to explain something about that indicator and the position of the operator regarding that indicator. So for version 5.1 of the production standard, we had selected 3 core indicators for which we will publish the results on the website following audit. And there was indicator 2.1.2, which is regarding the management of health and safety hazard and risks. The indicator 3.2.1, which was about management plan around climate change mitigation and resilience. And then indicator 4.3.2, which is around a water stewardship plan. Again, 3 core indicators, which means by the time we are publishing this information online, it means a positive certification decision has been taken. And as you have as an operator to comply with all core indicators, it means that you will always be expected to be compliant by the time we publish. Now, what we did is we did analysis to try to find an equivalent set of indicators with version 4.2 of the standard. So we selected indicator 2.2.2 regarding health and safety risks, which is also a core indicator. We selected 4.1.3 around environmental issues, how it's covered in the environmental impact and management plan, which is again quite mirroring the other one from 5.1. And then we didn't have an equivalent for the water. Sorry, a bit of water. We didn't have an equivalent for the water stewardship plan, so we selected indicator 2.1.2 around the absence of forced or compulsory labor. So those sets of indicators, once again, once the audit has been carried out and certification decision taken, Bonsucro will receive the information from the certification body and publish the results for those indicators depending on which version has been taken. One more rule around auditing is around pending corrective actions. So when you move from version 4.2 of the standard to being audited to version 5.1, and it will be a similar case when you move to 5.2, there might be some indicators that are not necessarily matching. So in terms, if you have a corrective action plan from your previous audit against 4.2, which is still pending by the time you have your audit against 5.1 or even 5.2, as I mentioned, we are expecting you to work as an operator with the auditor to try to map this, to evaluate this action plan, map it against the new standard and adapt it if necessary. So to give an example, in the version 4.2 of the standard, you have indicator 5.4.2, which is around energy used in energy used in cane transport per ton of cane transported. That indicator as such is no longer in version 5.1 of the Bonsucro Production Standard. So what we consider in that case is indicator 3.2.5, which is around the operator maximizing the energy return on energy invested. And there's a link there because the energy used in cane transport is used in the calculation of that new indicator in the 5.1. So in that case, we would expect the auditor to discuss with the operator if a corrective action plan is still pending on that indicator to see how that corrective action plan might be transferred under the new audits and assessed and progressed in a productive and pragmatic manner. And again, on that topic, as and when the audits happen, if you have any question, if you want to discuss a scenario, especially the auditors, I would encourage you to email standards@bonsucro.com to discuss with Bonsucro. Now, a couple of examples regarding Annex 1. So that's where we transferred the transition policy from March of this year into this updated version of the transition policy. And there's a list of a dozen indicators, core and non-core, where we decided that there was we needed an adapted transition pathway to enable the operator to implement that indicator and start being evaluated against it. So we consider several factors such as cost implication, timelines, need to recruit a consultant, scale of the implementation, and also sometimes the fact that some indicators requires collection of data which might not have been available in 2022. So on that basis, we made a list, and I'll give you a couple of examples, but if you have more questions again on that one, you feel free to have a look at the annex and reach out to us via email. So one example I would highlight is one that has caused almost maybe confusion, and it's regarding indicator 1.2.3, which is also linked to indicator 1.2.4 in the new standard. And this is about the operator conducts and documents an improvement opportunity assessment outside the unit of certification. So first and foremost, what I would like to indicate and remind everyone, because there's been a lot of confusion on that, is we are not asking the operator to enforce the standard outside the unit of certification. We are not going to evaluate whether area outside the unit of certification complies with the standard, because we are not certifying that area. What we ask here is a risk assessment and a plan around that risk assessment. So that's very, very different. So what we considered is like some operators might have quite a broad supply area in terms of external suppliers, own suppliers, etc., and it might take a bit of time to roll out and do this assessment across that supply area. So the core indicator, for that core indicator, we created an adapted transition pathway, whereby when you audit it for the first time to version 5.1, what you have to show is that you've started doing that work required by the indicator for part of the areas outside the unit of certification. We're not giving you a percentage of how much you have to do, but that you started the work, and then that you have a plan in place about how you're going to roll out the indicator requirements across the rest of the area over the next 2 years. So it's quite a long timeline. So in your first audit against 5.1, it's about having a plan about the plan, basically. It's nothing else. And we're not giving you a minimum or maximum about what you need to achieve by your first audit in terms of the size of the supply area you need to cover on that. So that's the first example. And we have a few examples like that in that annex. The other example would be, for example, indicator 2.1.3, the operator ensures that workers have access to safe water and adequate sanitation. So this is also a core indicator introduced by 5.1. It's not entirely a new indicator, because there was already an indicator on safe access to safe water. What we added with the new standards is the part about adequate sanitation facilities, which might have been covered before in another indicator as part of obey the law in 1.1.1, but here it's been regrouped under 2.1.3. So we consider that indicator earlier this year, and we understand that there might be, you know, in some countries, there are national laws that are requiring this to happen. So it might already be in place. In some countries, it might not be in place yet. So what we decide is to give an adapted timeline where an operator would have to invest to create those facilities at farm and mill side. And for them to have time to plan, to contract, and to adapt their ways of working. And so by the time you are audited for the first time against version 5.1 of the standard, what we ask you to have is to have a plan in place about how you're going to address this indicator by the next audit. So that's the minimum we require, that you have thought through this indicator and you've come up with a plan about how you're going to comply. Obviously, if you already comply because the law requires you, then you would demonstrate that at your first audit. Now, changing version of the standard, looking at version 4.2, as I mentioned earlier, we have an adapted transition pathway for specific indicator, what we found was the most problematic over the last few years. And it's the one 1.1.1 regarding national laws complied with. It's under the principle of obey the law. Now, as you know, that indicator now has changed in new version of the production standard, because the wording we have under 4.2 is very prescriptive and very limiting in its interpretation. So the new version of the standard talks about having a plan to monitor and comply with the law, not comply with the law. However, if you get an audit against version 4.2 of the standard and you have to comply with 1.1.1, we have had a workaround in place to make sure we don't penalize operators in cases where they don't fully comply for reasons that are outside their reach or their control. And the most usual examples we've seen over the last few years is an operator complying with the law in practice, having done all their duties in regard to the laws and regulation of the country, but maybe they don't have a license, or they don't have the new license or on the particular point. And this might be due to the fact that the authorities or the agency required to maybe verify the operation or to issue that license might run late into their program and the license hasn't been delivered yet. So what like we said to other to auditors for the past few years, is what they have to consider is whether the operator has done everything they could, everything under their control they could to comply with all aspects and receive the relevant documentation. And they can demonstrate that, this will not be considered as a systemic non-conformity, but only as an incidental. And two, what we adapted in this particular case is that we allow the certification body to agree a longer time frame to comply with the corrective action plan of, receiving the license, for example, than what is currently indicated in the certification protocol version 6. So a longer time frame allowed for incidental nonconformity against 1.1.1. And for that, the certification body doesn't need to apply for an exemption to Bonsucro. It's an automatic exemption until the end, until the beginning of December, basically. So just to allow this indicator monitoring to run a bit more smoothly. The Annex 3, so we did Annex 1 and 2. Annex 3 is regarding the interaction between Bonsucro EU Red Standard and Bonsucro standards. As you know, when an operator decides to add the option of EU Red on top of the Bonsucro certification, there's an additional set of requirements that need to be complied with, which is a bit more restrictive than the Bonsucro only standard. So the operators need to be audited to, for example, the Bonsucro Production Standard and the Bonsucro EU Red Standard as well. As you know, back in July 2021, we published a new version of the Bonsucro EU Red Standard. It was Bonsucro adaptation of its standard to the EU Red 2 directive that had been published a couple of years before by the European Commission. And Bonsucro was approved by the European Commission in June 2021 to carry out audits or to facilitate certification services through its certification bodies against EU Red 2 using the Bonsucro EU Red Standard version 1. However, that standard version works with, when you combine it with the Bonsucro Production Standard version 4.2, and when you use it with version 5.1, which is absolutely fine. For version 4.2, what we did is create a workaround, because on some of the GHG calculation, the calculator 4.1.6 is not fully adapted to the new EU Red regulation. So we created a workaround for auditors to be able to evaluate. So if you audited against 4.2 and EU Red, you use calculator 4.1.6 and the workaround provided. If you audit it to version 5.1 of our standard and EU Red, you can use the latest calculator and the calculator is adapted. So no problem implementing that standard and using that option. What we want to mention here is what might be a bit of a challenge in the coming weeks. Because after our approval in June 2021 by the European Commission published in July of this year, an implementing act, which is there to support the EU Red directive. That implementing act adds additional requirements for schemes like Bonsucro to audit against EU Red requirements. So what we did is we updated a Bonsucro EU Red standard and produced a version 2 and sent the draft to the European Commission. and we are waiting approval. We submitted a draft on 31st of August 2022, and we haven't heard back yet. So we're waiting for the approval. And again, that version 2 of the Bonsucro E-rate standard is just a few adaptation that was brought about by the Implementing Act. However, when we created that new draft, we based it on references of the Bonsucro Production Standard version 5.1 and not on 4.2. So once the Bonsucro E-rate standard version 2 is approved by the Commission, it will work with version 5.1 of the Bonsucro Production Standard. But what we don't know is what the European Commission position will be as to using the Bonsucro E-rate standard version 2 with the previous version of our production standard, which is 4.2. There might be a possibility to create an adaptation there, or an interim kind of documents, but that's a conversation we cannot have with the European Commission yet. We first need to get their approval on version 2 of the Bonsucro E-rate standard before starting that conversation. So that will not happen within 24 hours. And even when we receive that approval, there will be a level of transition period to the new standards. So watch this space. We'll share more information in the coming weeks once we hear back from the European Commission. Regarding Annex 4, very briefly, this is aimed at certification body and training providers licensed by Bonsucro. So it's not aimed at mills operators or any other stakeholders. And it's a clarification around qualification exams and training for 4.2, because since April of this year, we've been focusing on qualifying auditors, technical managers, and trainers to version 5.1 of the standards. And what we want to do is not create any further disruption. So we have in Annex 4 mapped out a few options to try to make it as smooth as possible for auditors and trainers to be recognized against version 4.2 of the standard. And for that, those options are based on considering whether that auditor or trainer had prior qualification to 4.2, but also or in combination with maybe having experience auditing or training to 4.2. So those, we considered a few risk elements and possibility of, try to capitalize on existing knowledge. And based on that, we can extend qualification certificates or find workarounds. So I would invite you to have a look at Annex 4 and let us know if you have any questions. Great. So one last thing would be the next step, and then we can have any question you may have. So in terms of next step, as we mentioned, the important thing to retain is the reason why we have extended version 4.2 of the Bonsucro Production Standard is to enable us to carry out an interim revision of version 5.1 of the standard in good conditions. And that's what we refer to as the interim revision. What we can share at this stage is that we're going to be publishing the terms of reference of around this revision in February 2023. Then there will be a development, a revision and a development of the updated version 5.2 between, well, it's already started. We had already started working on all the feedback we received from stakeholders, and that will run until April 2023. And our aim is to publish by June 2023 to then enable, as I mentioned at the beginning, a few months of training, engagement, support for implementation to start the audit at the end of 2023. We will share more information on our website. We've been updating pages on our website, and the next one we're going to be updating is the one around standards development and revision. So we let you know, we communicate to you through the bulletin and other mailing list to make sure that once this is published, it's communicated to you. And I think that brings us to the end of our presentation. So if there are any questions, or later, if there's anything you would like to add that I might have missed out, please feel free to do so.
No, Celine, all fine from my side. Thanks.
Okay. So yes, if you have any question, please use the Q&A function to share any question or comments. Thank you. I can see that Eden and Aleida have been sharing information on the chatter about links to key documents. And thank you both for your support during this presentation. If there are no questions regarding this presentation, then I just would like to say thank you for attending. As I mentioned, this recording is going to be shared on our website by the end of this week. We're running 3 sessions. So yesterday we had a session in Spanish, today was in English, and this afternoon we're running a session in Portuguese around the transition policy. Feel free to attend and register as well. And if you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to us by emailing us at standards@bonsucro.com to tell us your feedback, or if you have any question regarding that transition policy. And if there's no question, then I will thank you for attending and wish you a good day.